I hear all the time still to this day, coaches tell their athletes, like, when you step on this field, when you step across this line into this building, like, you got to leave everything behind, right? Like, nothing else matters. Motivationally speaking, that's great. But when we're dealing with emotions and when we're dealing with trauma or things that people are going through, these things are actually held in our body. And so even if we wanted to turn this off in our mind, our body is having a physiological reaction to the events like losing an election in middle school. And so it's not as easy as just being able to turn it off, right?
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to AthletesClass podcast. I'm your host, Sean Boyd, and I am fired up. I've been waiting for this one. We often talk about the mechanics of performance, but I think what today's episode talks about more than the mechanics is actually the human underneath that jersey. Today is about seeing the whole picture, the mental, the physical, and the emotional. Caitlin Broadwell joins us to discuss her journey from D2 indoor standout to D1 beach volleyball player at LSU, completely unexpected. We talk about the high achievement and toxic perfectionism. We break down the holistic wheel of performance. We redefine what true resilience actually looks like. And more important than anything, finding the joy in the process as the ultimate competitive advantage. As always, make sure your notebook is close. This one is packed with tools for athletes, parents, coaches, and psychologists in training. Let's go. You were recruited out of high school. You played both D2 and D1, indoor and outdoor volleyball.
Mm-hmm.
Why, after your career, did you pursue mental health in athletics?
Yeah, it's not something that came after my career. In 8th grade, I had this amazing psychology teacher, and he revealed to us that there's this thing called a sports psychologist. And I'm like, I'm an athlete and like human behavior is super interesting to me. That's what I want to be. And so that goal never changed all throughout high school, all throughout college, all the way to grad school when I actually got my counseling degree. And it was something that when I finally got towards the end, when I was finishing up all my hours and my internship and my master's program, I was really nervous that I was like, this is something I wanted my whole life. Like, what if I don't like it? And turns out, I knew what I wanted in 8th grade and that hasn't changed. And I went through my own experience, as most college athletes do, of struggling with the anxiety and the pressure of being a college student athlete. And so I wanted to be that support, and going through that myself only made me want to do it more.
When you said you had a mentor, walk me through what those first memories are of that. Maybe it's a light bulb moment. Maybe it was like something they said, or maybe it was an experience or the overall. But what was the moment that you felt like, oh gosh, that's it. That's what I'm kind of locked in on.
Yeah, I would say during grad school, I had the opportunity to play beach volleyball at LSU for my 5th year, and they have amazing resources there. One of them being an incredible sport psychology department, and Dr. Lakeitha Poole is the head of that department, and she was my sport psychologist. And that first year, when she was my sports psychologist, I actually got to see like a real human person living out what I wanted to do, because it was hard for me to imagine what a sports psychologist actually looked like, because I hadn't seen one before, and especially like her being a Black woman in this industry where, one, there isn't a lot of Black women in those leadership positions, and I'm Latina, and like even though we're like not the same, right? It's like that representation that matters, that like we can still exist in spaces that maybe weren't built for us. And so on like all different scales, she was a huge representation for me of like the sports psychology position, but also a woman of color in leadership at a huge university.
That's awesome. I mean, they say that all the time, like how important it is to see yourself in some way, shape, or form. When you look back at those first memories of seeing that sports psychologist in real life, what are the things that you noticed that what were the behaviors or the actions or some of the early stuff that you're like, ooh, maybe there's something that you continue to use. Maybe there's a tool or a thought. Tell me a little bit about like seeing it for the first time in real life. What are some of those early memories of, wow, this is really what a sports psychologist does?
I remember her coming and meeting with the team and doing an activity, and it was something that bonded us and connected us, and it was really fun. It was like lighthearted. And I remember thinking when I was imagining sports psychology, I was imagining like working with student athletes that were like really struggling, whether that was like performance based or mental health based. And that's when I realized like it's such a broad spectrum of ways to address mental health, ways to address performance based skills. It's not like this serious, like one-on-one type of session every single time. It's like something that she found creative ways to like do amazing team building sessions with us. And I could see the impact because that year, our team was especially very, very close and still some of my great friends to this day. And I think that's part of the culture that she helped build alongside our coaches as well.
You have the language, and I feel like when you start talking about the mental health, and you kind of mentioned it right there, this idea of holistic, right? What is holistic? I feel like that's a common word that gets thrown around, but tell me a little bit about what holistic is, what the actual meaning is, and then why it's so important on the mental side of athletics.
Yeah, I can't think about providing care to student athletes without the term holistic because it's such a chain of events. If we're working with student athletes and we're ignoring, let's say, the part where they're not getting enough food, or the part where they're actually living in a car because they're homeless, or the part where they're very isolated and socially struggling, we cannot address these other parts, or we can't tend to these other parts and become successful out of it if like a piece of the wheel is missing. And so when I'm thinking of holistic, I'm looking at an individual on a lens, what we call like psychosocial lens of like what is happening to them internally, socially, systemically on every level. And that is a lens that I can't turn off. And so when I'm working with student athletes, right, like we're asking every single question that we can to get a full picture of what is actually going on so we can address and get to the point of if they're struggling sleeping, that may be part of the wheel that's missing, but it also may be because they're dealing with anxiety. And so like the physical and mental piece go together, same with their performance, their academic, their family, things that they got going on. And so holistic is making sure we're looking at the whole entire wheel, because if a chunk is missing and we're not addressing it, then they're going to be a little bit lopsided and they can't fully go and function as well as I believe they can if their wheel is complete.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think about that as even a middle school basketball coach. We had a moment last year where the bi-yearly government elections happened, right, at the middle school level, and we had kids who won and kids who lost on the same team. And we were going into a rivalry. This was a big game for them, and we had to ultimately understand and recognize that a massive emotional toll was taken that day, positive and negative on the same team. So that is such a small scale, but it feels like as coaches or as athletes, the idea that we can just harden up and just show up and forget it all and let it go is like, that's what I feel like we've been told or trained. When you think of that idea of showing up to a practice or a game and having something that's like pretty emotional in terms of a toll, when somebody comes in and has that with you, what's the response that you give them, or the tool that you help them with, or how do you guys work with an athlete in that setting?
Yeah, I love that point that you brought up, Sean. So before I answer that, I want to tap more into the idea that athletics as a whole. I hear all the time still to this day, coaches tell their athletes, like, when you step on this field, when you step across this line into this building, like, you got to leave everything behind, right? Like nothing else matters. And motivationally speaking, that's great. But when we're dealing with emotions and when we're dealing with trauma or things that people are going through, unfortunately, these things are actually held in our body. And so even if we wanted to turn this off in our mind, our body is having a physiological reaction to the events like losing an election in middle school has on them. And so it's not as easy as just being able to turn it off, right? And so I always try to educate our coaching staff and student athletes of that reality, but it's a little bit harder to understand because it's like, what do you mean when I'm sad? Like that stays in my body. We can feel it. And so when I'm dealing with student athletes that they need to regulate themselves before they step into a game or before they step into practice or training, because it can be dangerous if you're not all the way focused in some sports. Right.
Yeah.
And so I do a lot of like somatic body work. And so it's connecting the mind and body. So whether that's deep breathing, whether that's trying to regulate through music or through meditation, there's a lot of different ways depending on the student athlete and what they're open to that we try to connect the mind and body and do it more physically than just like mentally, like, hey, let's like turn it off for this game, right? And so it's like actually trying to slow down their nervous system when something is happening and like redirect their attention so they can also then turn up their nervous system to perform at a peak level. So it's kind of like teetering along like a tightrope, trying to figure out how slow we need them to go, but also how high we need their nervous system to get when they're competing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it feels like that's an individual challenge too, right? That idea that every person's going to react to a different tool or a different method. And that's where that kind of individualistic approach and that holistic approach of saying, okay, I understand your story, I understand who you are, and how valuable that is. What are some trends that you feel like you saw coming in this year that just felt common to you, just in terms of what college athletes are dealing with right now in today's day and age?
Yeah, I would say a lot of them are definitely overwhelmed with their schedule, overwhelmed with the pressure that they have. And that's not just from this semester. That's a common theme I can remember feeling when I was in college too. But a lot of them are, I think, dealing with the question of, this is a full-time job. This is a lot of effort. Is it worth it? Like, is it worth it to them to put their body, their mind, and sacrifice all this time for something at this level? Like, this is a mid-major D1 institution. And so they're competing and practicing just as much as any other D1, but there isn't as many resources. And so there is a challenge there. But I would say the anxiety and overwhelm really gets to them. And then, I think like this year, it's been a lot of just like personal, it comes in waves, which is very interesting. And a lot of other sports athletic counselors, like, we talk about how sometimes like everything just comes at once. So like I'll have a chunk of folks struggling with eating disorders in one semester, and then, for a couple years I won't see it that much. And so this semester has been just a lot of like family and like friend things happening that is drawing our student athletes' focus away from school and sports. And so I guess that was like a theme of this semester, was a lot of personal things going on.
When somebody comes with a personal matter like that, when you're like the separation of athlete and life, right? I am a performer, I'm a competitor, and then I also am this human, and they're the same. You're still human, but you have a life that's outside of between the lines, right? As the coaches like to say. In that setting, and obviously, you can look back at some of the biggest names, going through that publicly. Simone Biles comes to mind right away, whereas, like trying to sort out and figure out. Naomi Osaka has also dealt with that, and you go down the line in the list. But to you guys, when you're there, have you seen, or do you work with, or do you have a tool set that you offer that you see that you say, okay, this is what helps through that? Or is it an individual basis? Is it every single person is its own sort of thing that you go after and attack?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a little bit of both when we're dealing with certain, I guess, like behaviors or symptoms that they're experiencing. There's definitely like modalities that work best for people that are like going through depression, people that are going through anxiety. I think where it becomes like the more individualistic is sometimes the symptoms of anxiety and depression look like anxiety and depression, but when we actually take a further, deeper dive into the person as a whole, we can see, oh, wow, like they actually have a like significant trauma history. And so this may be actual symptoms of trauma instead of just like generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder. So it could be manifesting itself in a certain way. And so then we would be treating it differently. It's a little bit of both. Like we use common tools depending on the like interventions used, but for each person, that's why it's like really important when we do our intakes where we're asking every possible question in every area of their life, asking about their family history, asking about their medical history to see if there's more things happening that could be presenting as depression, right? I'll give you like a personal example. So I was going through significant depression in high school and, it looked like depression. It felt like depression. It was depression. But part of what I was also going through was I experienced Graves' disease, which is a thyroid disorder. And part of Graves' disease is it's always looking like depression. And so because part of the disease is like a really fast heart rate, major fatigue, weight loss, all of these symptoms look like depression and fit in the scope that is like the requirements to like be diagnosed with depression. And so part of that is always making sure like other pieces of what someone's going through doesn't also look like a mental health disorder. And so though I was experiencing that, it was actually from my physical like Graves' disease than a mental health disease.
I am like, I feel like I just had like 35 questions come up, but the first one, I'll just start with one and see where it goes. You know, it feels like there's this trend in articles that are written in the kind of the mass media that is suggesting that this generation is dealing with, you know, mental health at a much higher rate quantity wise than we ever have in the past. And you just brought up your high school experience. I have my high school experience. If we go back, you know, 5, 10, 20, 40 years, is in your experience, do we have a higher trend of mental health, or are we recognizing it in new ways that we didn't previously see it before? I don't know if you can even answer that, but
yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think some things to think about, I don't have the answer for that, but some things to think about is I know even like when I just said what I was going through in high school, like that wasn't, I didn't get help for it. And so like that wasn't accounted for. Yeah. And I know our generations before us definitely didn't get help then, right? Like it was so normalized.
Yeah.
All of the unhealthy behaviors that were going on. And so I think one is like a lot of them weren't being accounted for. A lot of the research wasn't as available as it is today, right? Because they can go, like researchers can look at algorithms and look at what these young teenagers are looking on TikTok and kind of guess like where they are mental health wise. So there's so much more available. I think there's also so much more information that we can access that we didn't have free access to. I don't think it's any different. I think we just now have names for it. And so, I can't imagine like our generations that went through the Great Depression or went through like the World War I and II were any better than what we're dealing with here, but we just have like names for it now.
Ooh, I'm going to kind of shift here into this idea of your relationship with perfectionism. And I feel like we kind of talked about this before, but can you define perfectionism in your own way and then tell us how it manifests itself in athletics in both healthy and unhealthy ways?
Yeah. So when I think of perfectionism, I think of striving for, not making any errors or not having any flaws. And when we're looking at like performance-based, when we're looking at even personal, we generalize this idea of perfectionism from being athletes. I think when I'm working with athletes, this is a constant theme across the board, male, female, doesn't matter where they're coming from, freshman, senior, because we are constantly striving to not make any errors, constantly striving to not have any flaws in our game. And that push and drive is incredible, and actually what makes me believe that like student athletes are oftentimes a lot more successful than and confident than folks that didn't experience going through athletics, because we know how to work really, really hard to like reach our goal, work really, really hard to be able to perform at a high level. But on the other end of that, our brain doesn't know how to separate, and like we tend to generalize concepts and beliefs like this. And this bleeds into even like self-belief or the way they look at other people or the world. And so a lot of my student athletes, like every year, that's a major theme of like breaking down the wall of like, you don't have to be perfect. You are going to have flaws, and learning how to accept that and learning how to not beat yourself up over that. Because I mean, I think every athlete can relate to this, but like after games, a lot of us tend to look at every error that we made, so we're not making that again, right? Like, oh, like I missed like however many shots, I hit so many balls out, and like what did I do? How can I change that so next time that doesn't happen? That's a great critical thinking skill to have, looking back and reflecting on the errors that you made so you can make a change. But they're doing that with every interaction they have now socially. They're doing that with every academic mistake that they make. And so perfectionism, though it can be helpful, it can also be very hurtful to their self-belief and self-confidence.
What is something you've recognized about your relationship with perfectionism over the past couple of years, or call it, I won't define that timeline for you, in ways that you feel like you've gotten so much better, and in ways you still want to work?
Yeah, I remember like talking with my friend one time, realizing like, shoot, like I am really, really hard on myself and like low key a perfectionist. And like she just started laughing, and she was like, why did you not know that? Like it's very clear, like you are like very wanting to be the best at everything. And I'm just like, well, like I thought a perfectionism like really cared about their appearance. I like wanted to look perfect. Like that was my idea of perfectionism before. And I'm like, I don't really care. Like I walk out in sweats. I like barely brush my hair. Like I'm very laid back and whatnot. And so like my idea of perfectionism changed when I realized like I had it. Like I thought I was immune to it, even like after athletics. And so working through that, I think that's going to be something I'm forever working on and trying to weed out. I don't think we can ever come to a place of like finally getting there. So it's constantly challenging my brain on, like one, noticing when that's coming up, because like for me, that comes up a lot socially and also like emotionally. Like if I'm not saying or responding in a way that I want to respond, that I think is like the best human response that, could ever be. And when it's not going in that way that I want it to look, then I beat myself up over it, right? And like if I make a mistake in work, I'm like, that can't ever happen again. And it's like, it's going to happen again, So the pressure that we put on ourselves to be perfect can be detrimental. And so part of my learning is like that major self-compassion. One of my favorite things is like, that was a human response. Like that was just like a human thing to do, to try to like normalize it and be like, I'm human. This is normal to make mistakes and to mess up. And so, yeah, that's something I'm still constantly having to remind myself and continue practicing.
For you, you talk about the idea of athletes coming to you with perfectionism or something you recognize and see and help them through. Another one is failure, right? I continue to talk about this on our podcast and in our work, is like the fear of failure being one of the top reasons why kids leave sports at an early age, right? They're afraid of failing. For you, perfectionism to failure, what's that relationship to failure for you, and how do you help others through it?
Yeah. I think it depends on folks' definition of failure. I've had so many young clients because I do private practice on the side. So I work with teenage athletes, and a lot of them end up wanting to quit because they are so embarrassed that if they're like doing bad, then that feels like the worst possible thing ever for them than even just like not competing at all, even if they love the sport itself. And so people's definition of failure is different. Probably when I was younger, I felt like a failure would be like if I didn't make it to college, where some people in high school, their failure would be like if they didn't make the varsity team compared to the JV team, right? And so looking at the definition of failure, looking at like when we're looking at their goals, when we're looking at where they are actually, is it realistic? Is it a big jump, right? Like if you're wanting to be in the NBA, the NFL, is that realistic? And then how can we like get you there? And when we're looking at failures, like that is the piece where like I love teaching growth mindset because it's about the process. And I think like at that age, usually when we're dealing with teenagers or even middle schoolers, like you're a middle school coach, their brain likes to think in like black and white, likes to be a little bit more concrete than those with like fully developed frontal lobes. And so they look at like the risk of failure as like a like all or nothing type task. And so that makes it a little bit harder for them to comprehend that like, okay, like if I have a bad practice or if I'm missing these shots, then like I'm completely a failure. Like then they kind of flip to like, yeah, I shouldn't be on the basketball team. And so it's teaching them, especially at that age. Like I think the growth mindset needs to be taught in like grade school, but teaching them that like it's a process and like they're not arriving to the place that they need to arrive in middle school or high school. Like their place of arrival in athletics, I'm talking specifically, is going to happen when they reach their peak performance, whether that's in college or professionally. And so I'm pretty sure even LeBron doesn't think he's arrived yet and looks at failure as like an opportunity to continue just like sharpening his skill set.
I love that. I love that idea that LeBron still is trying to seek that, right?
Mhm.
And I think that there's many examples throughout sports history of, whether it be, I was just thinking about Tom Brady, like Phillip Rivers just came back at 44 years old, and
Mhm.
not
Mhm.
seeking that perfection. But that idea that like, we're always, you're always on the journey. You're always in the process. You're always focused on, the one thing in front of you. And I think that's that weird relationship with goals, right?
Mhm.
We have this idea that if you have a goal, but you can't control a goal. So the only thing you can actually control, the only controllables is the process, is the thing that's going to get you from here to there, right? Now let's flip to the word resilience, because there's perfection. There's
Mhm.
this idea of failure and how we all define it for ourselves. Resilience is the thing that has us showing up again and again and again and again and again. For you, what does resilience mean? What does that look like for you? And what comes to mind when you think of resilience?
Yeah, I think when I think of resilience, I'm thinking about when someone faces an obstacle, they're able to make a decision that they get to decide if they want to cross it or not, right? And crossing it, because I think sometimes we think of resilience of like getting knocked down and being able to stand back up. But sometimes I don't think it's appropriate to stand back up, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think resilience could look like deciding to step away from sport if need be to, take care of the self, right? I think resilience is being able to look at an obstacle, take a failure, and be able to make a decision what is best for them. And I say that carefully because I think so many of us get confused with like resilience being like never stopping and never like backing down. But I don't think that's appropriate. And it puts a lot of our student athletes in this mindset that even when their body is literally decaying in front of them from the amount of brutal force that they put themselves through, they still want to be like resilient and like push through. When I think resilience would be allowing themselves to step away from the sport. But resilience is so important when we're like talking about failure and perfectionism. That's part of the process, right? Like that's them learning that when they do make mistakes, when they do have bad games, that isn't going to stop them from having a good game. And that's like where it's really hard to teach athletes this, but when athletes do get it, that's usually a skill that they keep with them for most of their life, even post athletics, because athletes are some of the most resilient people. The things that we've gone through, the things that we've had to wake up really early and do that probably when we were athletes isn't legal anymore. We are super resilient. And I think that's a skill specifically that student athletes get to gain, that most normal people like aren't faced with so many challenges at such a young age and like so consistently. And it gives us immense confidence that we can go up with like any challenge that we're faced.
There's so many good nuggets in there. When you think about your career, so I'm gonna kind of dive into your story a little bit here, and you talk about failure and perfectionism and resilience, and maybe a little bit about loss. You were sidelined 3 times in your career. You've talked about one of those, which whether it was diagnosed or undiagnosed or however that happened, you were sidelined, and it actually led to in high school, sort of a pretty big recruiting pause, right? In your career. When you think about that and the uncontrollables that you have there, how did you bounce forward and how did you make that decision? How did you grow your resilience through those experiences?
Yes. So when I was in high school, I got diagnosed with Graves' disease, and it took me out of sport for like 3-4 months in the middle of the like prime recruiting time, my junior year of high school. And I slowly watched every school besides 2 universities lose interest and not reply to my emails and say, sorry, we filled the spot. That was absolutely devastating. And I think at the time there was so much going on because I had these health issues. I had to pause sport. And so I just like wasn't doing anything. I'd go home and I would just sleep all day, mostly because I was so exhausted from my body just like really struggling. And so thankfully, I feel like during that time, I was so naive to the significance of it that I didn't, when I think about that time, like I never thought that like it wasn't going to happen for me. I just knew that it wasn't going to look like what I was expecting. I was expecting to be able to compete at a D1 university. And so when I only had 2 universities left and they were D2, I was like more so embarrassed, I would say, than anything, because I had these high hopes and people had these expectations that like I would be someone that like would go play at a big school. And so it was a little bit embarrassing for me, but I think like the resilience part was I felt like I had to make the most of my situation. Like I knew that because I experienced losing sport for some time and not knowing how I was going to return to it, that when I got back out there, I was going to like grind and become the greatest at my craft. So if I was at a D2, then I'm going to become like an All-American there. And I'm going to help my team, reach new heights that they haven't reached before. I think I just like refocus, and I think that's where the resilience came in, is like, let me just reframe my situation that I'm in because I don't have control of where I get to go. Let me create new goals. Let me think about it in a new way. I'm so thankful that my path went that way because I ended up where I never would have expected. But yeah, I think that's part of the resilience, is being able to take what happened to me, and be able to make the most of it.
Well, how did you decide to go from Colorado to LSU? What was that moment like in your mind? And you obviously the transition from indoor to outdoor. Tell me about that moment and how you came to that decision.
Yeah, it was actually such a crazy and not normal path to going to a new school for like beach volleyball. I had finished up my indoor career at CSU Pueblo, and unfortunately, like that year, my body was done for. I was limping off every practice and like I could barely finish practices because my body was just like so destroyed. And so when we finished, I was so happy. I was living my best life. I was going to the mountains, going out with my friends, playing intramural football. Like I loved being done with sport because I was so over it. And then I applied to all these grad schools and I got rejected from all of them. And I was like, well, let me go move to Australia and be a nanny for this family on the beach. I can surf, throughout the day, whatever. And so I was about to move over there and then I got connected with the LSU coach and he was like, yeah, like I would love to have more like leadership on the team. Like, can you come play for us? I didn't think that was actually going to happen. And I was like, are you sure? But it was such a gift to me to be able to, in my college experience, at one of the best D1 universities to be an athlete at.
Yeah.
And I didn't play that much like for beach volleyball. It was a new sport for me. My teammates are now Olympians. So I was like playing with the most like top level athletes ever. But it was like an experience where I felt like I finally got to experience what I was hoping my college experience was going to be like all 4 years. Cause like all throughout college, in indoor, I would watch the volleyball national championships and be like, I should be there. Like, I feel like I don't get to reach my full potential because I don't have the resources and the coaches that they do. And so I felt like with indoor, I never knew actually how good I could get. And then I was like gifted this opportunity to play beach volleyball at LSU. And I didn't have enough time to get as good as I wanted to at beach, but I had so much gratitude and appreciation for being a student athlete at LSU. So I feel like that experience almost wasn't athletic based. It was just like a reward for everything I went through and like following through on like my goal and being resilient indoor and then like getting to experience playing with like one of the best teams in the country. It was one of my favorite experiences.
That feels like it was a lot of fun. Like you found joy in those years in LSU. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I found joy in the sport. And like, that's also why it was so much harder for me to leave. Where
Yeah.
like indoor, I was like, get me out of here. I cannot wait for this season to be done. And then at LSU, I was just like, every like day, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the last like first day of practice. This is the last, like week of practice, just counting down. I didn't want it to end because the team was amazing. The coaches were amazing. The experience was incredible. It made it 10 times harder for me to like leave that sport.
I saw something recently. I think it was about Novak Djokovic. He talks about this idea of the longevity of playing, and the reason why he feels like he can play forever is because he just loves hitting a tennis ball, and there's joy in that. But I think as an amateur athlete, oftentimes we come up against, whether it be in middle school or high school, whether it be coaches or peers or the politics of a system that's in place, that we find ourselves losing that joy. So for you to be able to find that joy, that happiness, that the fun in the sport, that to me feels like, oh God, what a great investment and shift for you into that moment.
Yes.
That's so great to hear. And I feel like I wish you could bottle up that and say like, here's how you go find joy. I don't know if you feel like there's anything out there that could be bottled so that everybody could go get it, but it feels like, okay, are you having any fun? Is kind of the question. When you talk about and have mentioned how each one of these sort of pauses has also been the reason why you are an author and have started this project called Hanging Up the Jersey, which you have now a podcast and a book. What did you notice about your own experience that you wanted to explore and help others learn about? And why are you doing this Hang Up the Jersey project?
Yeah. It's funny, like as I'm talking, I'm realizing a lot of these things that like I realize I want happen a lot earlier than like I think expected, because in 2016 I moved out to California for like this volleyball internship, and there was the US Olympic setter like 3 weeks before they went to Rio. She got cut from the team. And she didn't have like a place to live. She didn't know where to go. So she like moved in with the interns to play volleyball with us. And I remember being so shook at the fact that this is like Team USA. This is the highest level of women's volleyball. in the world, really. And she like got a trash bag full of her stuff in the locker room and was just like, bye. And there was like no transition plan. I remember speaking with her. I'm like, wait, like no one like helps you like figure out what to do next. Like they don't have anything set up for athletes when they're done. And she was just like, no, like we're just done. And like she had to figure out for herself what she wanted to do. And I remember in 2016 me like, what is like happening? Like if this happens at the highest level, like this is going to happen to me in college.
Yeah.
And so I remember like from then on in college, like every research paper or whatever, I was talking about what happens to athletes when they finish. And so I've been researching it for like 10 years. And then I think I was like so struck by it because I had a little taste of it in high school
Yeah.
when it got ripped away and I had to challenge my identity. And then, yeah, I experienced it in indoor when I was like ready. And that was a great transition experience. Like that was one of my favorites because I was still in college. I was having fun. And then I got to experience it again at LSU, and that was way harder. I had way more negative symptoms from the transition. Like I was depressed, I was lonely, I was isolated, I didn't know what to do with my time. There was a lot going on, and it was because of the amazing resources and things that we got from LSU that just like one day got cut off. And so I had been creating these programs for that volleyball internship I talked about. I got to practice. How do I like help athletes prep and plan for when this is going to happen? Because like no one told me that this was going to happen. No one talked about it. And I want athletes to feel prepared. And so I was making little like programs and like workshops for them to like do. And then when I got to Long Beach State, I turned it into an actual workshop, which then turned into a whole entire senior student athlete class that they take for a semester. And in that process, I was just like writing down all my thoughts and like ideas. And one of my coworkers, Lauren Edwards, was like, well, we need a like curriculum and like a book for this class. So like, you should like finish writing what you're writing. I'm like, I'm taking notes, like I'm not writing anything, and she's like, well, Caitlin's writing a book. And so we're going to use that book for the class. And so that completely pushed me to complete the workbook. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I was just like, let me just write down my thoughts and ideas. And it turned into like this actual workbook with activities. And it's as holistic as I could get in a workbook. We go from everywhere from like the mental health, the physical health, financial health, social aspect, identity, and like life skills, all in that workbook with research-backed information along with activities that I do with my senior student athletes that they have reported to me has been super helpful and has made them excited about their transition, because that's essentially what I want them to feel, is like not scared for when it's going to happen. I want them to be prepared for what athletes do experience. I don't want to sugarcoat it and be like, it's going to be great. I do a pretty good job of being realistic of like, hey, a lot of athletes experience this, but also like, look, like you get to rebrand, like you get to start over.
Yeah.
And in the middle of all of that, I also started like the podcast. And I think like the biggest piece I got from the podcast is majority of athletes feel like their life has only gotten better since athletics, and they love their life more than when they were an athlete. And when I say that to my class of seniors, they're always shocked. They're like, what do you mean like it can get better than this? Because you think it's the end of the world when it is done, because it's all you know. And so all of that to say, like, I think my experiences has allowed me to like speak on every aspect of it. Like I know what it's like to have an injury or illness end part of your career. I know what it's like to have a really bad career and be so happy it's done. And I know what it's like to have an amazing career and just like not be able to continue.
Yeah.
It allows me to speak on it on every aspect.
Well, that's it's so important. We've talked about this before. The example I continue to use is Missy Franklin and that idea of how public she's been about her identity. I have a friend who went to the Super. They ended up winning the Super Bowl back in the early 2000s. And it was the same thing. He was like, every single day there's a schedule that's posted and this is the food I'm supposed to eat, and that's just gone. You just one day it's here and the next day it's gone. And it's like such important work to be done to transition between those two worlds, right? At whatever level you're at, but especially from college onward. Caitlin, it was so great to hang out for a little bit. Fired up to have you on the Athletes Class pod. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It went by so fast. I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours. So thank you so much.
I feel the same way, and it feels like that every time where I'm like, okay, is this the point at which we're going to end? Because it feels like we're just getting started. And I think like maybe that's the crux of all of this is, you know, at the end of every podcast, you get to the place where like, wow, not only is this important, but like we don't recognize how every bit along the way as an athlete, whether it be the journey, whether it be injury, whether it be uncontrollables, whether it be dealing with resilience and defining that for yourself, whether in healthy or unhealthy ways, the nutrition, like you talked about nutrition as a mental component. Wow. What? Excuse me? Like that is like, we don't think about that. That's the physical. Nutrition's physical, but actually no, there's a significant amount, especially in athletics and sports, that nutrition is on the mental side of things. I just watched a whole 20-minute doc on a woman who's like dealing with, eating disorders and trying to figure out how to come back from it. It's like, it's forever, like, and we're just we're just starting to turn this rock open. So no, I'm so appreciative of even the small little nuggets we got today, but also the continued conversation, the idea of, continuing to open it up on your end with your athletes. And it feels like on campus, off campus, in your classes, with athletes, so you're making such a big impact. And high tide raises all boats. Like I hope we continue to build this, industry out because it feels like it's so important and vital to all of us. So
yes.
Thank you for being part of the small conversation today.
Thank you, Sean.
No short. Awesome. All right, Caitlin.